Good evening and welcome to Inside Government, a show for the spring 2023 semester here at Cayuga Community College and broadcast on Spectrum, Verizon, Fios, the Auburn Regional Media Access, better known as ARMA, as well as Win 89.1, the college's radio station. I'm your host, Guy Cosentino. With the 2020 census was completed, the process of redistricting occurred, and with that, the political map of Cayuga County changed somewhat. Instead of two members of the Assembly, Cayuga saw one swapped out for two new representatives, and we are delighted to have in the studio a new member representing Cayuga County, but someone who's been in the legislature since 2002, and is the Assembly Minority Leader Will Barclay, who is joining us. He represents three towns up in the northern part of the county, Ira, Sterling, and Victory. We've asked him on not only to give us an Albany update, but talk about how he's getting used to the district. He does represent Cayuga Community College's campus in Fulton, which we're delighted about. And glad to have you here in the studio.
Well,
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. And let me say I'm really excited about representing Cayuga County. I've always represented around the edges of Cayuga County. Of course, I'm from Oswego County, so I have the border with Cayuga there. But when I first started in the legislature, I had all the western part of Onondaga. So Skaneateles all the way up to Baldwinsville. So I had.
So this is your third redistricting.
This is my
map.
third one, right?
Yeah.
But I'm thrilled. There's a lot of issues similar that Cayuga County faces in the towns I represent.
So how do you get used to meeting the people of Ira and Victory and Sterling, but more importantly, learning what are issues, because there are some county-wide issues that come before you as well?
Well, interesting, the county-wide issues. So not only did I represent close to Cayuga County, but I sat next to Gary Finch and Bob Oakes when I was in the Assembly, two people that did represent Cayuga County. So in the past, I heard a lot about this county. But to get to know the real local issues, I've been out and visited with all the three supervisors and the town boards and the towns I represent. And, ultimately I just try to get out around the neighborhood and encourage anybody that has any issues to reach out to my office, which my district office is located in Fulton, again, not far from Cayuga County.
And so what are some of the issues that you're hearing about for those three townships, but more county-wide, what they're asking you about right now?
Well, generally, not surprising. I think it's been the same issue since I was elected, but economic development is always jobs and, what are we going to do to stop the outflow of migration out of New York State. But more specifically, I think recently is the Micron development coming in and how counties are going to be able to take advantage and what they need for infrastructure to, if this thing even happens, a quarter of it takes place is going to be really transformative for central New York, including Oswego, Onondaga, and Cayuga County.
So part of your district is within a couple of miles of the site. So, and I know we have some members of our boards here that are with Fulton Economic Development and Operation Oswego. There's a lot of land open there. Obviously, we have a Fulton campus. What do you think the secondary businesses, not necessarily the people who are going to be hired by Micron, but what do you think is going to happen to a lot of land values? I know housing has become an issue for everybody. I know Cayuga County's working on housing, Onondaga County's working on housing. I'm assuming Oswego's working on, and the flip side.
It's going to be hard. I think the housing is going to be one of the biggest challenges because our housing stock's already aged very much. And interestingly, I was speaking with the governor yesterday, and she's got this housing compact that she's pushing, trying to get through. I think she wanted, I forgot, 600 new units throughout the state by the end of a certain time period. So she's on it. I agree with some of the stuff that she's proposing, but I do agree with her the fact that our housing stock has aged out and we have to update it. So it's going to take really a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of private development to do it. And I think we can get the private development to do it as long as they know there's some sort of pot at the end of the development. So we'll see. We'll see. It's certainly going to affect land values. I think property prices presumably will increase. And
but what we commercial space and again those businesses that will service Micron or service businesses that service Micron?
Well, I think it's going to be tremendous, don't you? I mean, they're talking 9,000 people worked at Micron, putting aside the businesses. Just think of the food, the restaurants, the services that those workers are going to need. So that's going to be tremendous. But then, the vendors that are going to service Micron, I think they're talking, the spin-off jobs from the Micron are just going to be massive.
Not getting into the detail, and I told your staff I don't like math in that state. But was the incentive package, in your view, without getting into the details of it, the right type of package to attract a business, especially in this world where 50 states, and most likely within states are competing with each other.
Well, I think, Guy, it's a little unfortunate when we talk about these incentive packages because I think it points to the terrible business climate that we've had in New York State for a long time. We have high taxes here. We have a lot of regulation. So it's very difficult for business to either grow or even locate in New York because other parts of the country are much more competitive. So as a result of that, although this has changed over the last decade, so where other states are also offering huge incentive packages. But I think the only way you can attract these big businesses...
Well, I think that's what Rob Simpson and Ryan McMahon were saying was when it was leading up to this, there are other people competing.
Without it, Texas was a strong competitor. So it is a coup that we were able to get them. The other thing we shouldn't lose sight on, this was also the CHIPS program that the federal government instituted to try to bring chip manufacturers back from overseas for national security. I think that had a big play in this too.
So I want to get to the budget because let's talk about the budget. Where are you in the process? The governor released a $227 billion with a B program about a month ago, just a little over a month ago. Where is the legislature in the process?
You thought you couldn't do math. Well, you got the number.
That number.
That's a pretty sizable number. So
it is.
I'm impressed you're able to do that. So right now we're just finishing up. I think today was the last day. They do joint legislative hearings on the budget where they bring the agency heads and they bring any interest that wants to testify for something they like or don't like on the budget. So, for instance, one day they'll do education, another day they'll do transportation, they'll do local governments.
I know you're the minority leader. Do you sit in on those committee meetings as well, or what's your role?
Right. Well, my role has changed. I used to be the ranker on the Ways and Means Committee, where I had to sit through 2 weeks of those hearings. That was pretty taxing. It was worthwhile, but they're 12-hour hearings when you have.
But your role's changed.
It does. So now I don't have to sit in on, but I do keep a regular view of what's going on.
Well, you're watching them all.
Watching them all, absolutely. And I get reports back from our Ways and Means staff and from our ranker, Ed Ra, who's doing a great job on that committee.
So what do you like? I'm going to get to what you don't like.
Yeah.
Because I've watched some other interviews with you. What do you like in the budget, if anything?
Oh, definitely. First of all, the mental health issue. As you know, we are having a mental health crisis. So I'm happy to believe, particularly in rural areas where services aren't always available. And interesting, my wife works for, she'll be happy I say this, works for School of Health, and she's seen it on the front lines with child mental health issues, and I don't think we're addressing those as appropriately as we can. So I was pleased that the governor suggested $1 billion more for mental health funding. I think that's a bipartisan issue that we all can get behind.
There was also a jump in education spending.
It is. So that's
a significant jump.
Very much. So interestingly, some days I have the schools come in and they're complaining about things. This year they're pretty happy because of the substantial jump in education. So because there was a lawsuit about that sound and basic education a number of years ago, and then we had to slow down the funding, and they felt like they never got the full funding. So finally, to settle the whole thing, I think the governor proposed putting the substantial increase into education.
Do you think what has traditionally happened is the governor has done a minor increase, and the legislature then tends to add on? Do you think there'll still be an add-on?
Well, I think definitely. Okay. In my time in politics, I've never seen the legislature come back cutting the government.
No, but I'm just for education. For just education.
Well, there may be some, not in the foundation aid. I think that I'd be surprised that increase, but there might be other areas where they'll put money into education. So time will tell on that. But I do think overall, once the legislature gets through the budget, you'll see an increase in spending. Basically, the revenue looks fairly good this year. I think the revenue agreements, I think both houses were looking at about $1.7 billion more than what the governor initially opposed. And then I think they got an agreement on revenue that's $800 million over what the governor proposed in her initial budget. So there is revenue there. Always with this is the spending part of it.
What don't you like on the spending side?
Well, I just think the continuation. Everybody asks me, tell me where you would cut. And I would say it's not so much cutting, it's really slowing the growth of spending in New York. I mentioned in a TV interview the other day, when I started, the budget in the state was $78 billion. We're at $257 billion right now. I suspect it'll be higher than that by the time we pass a budget. And ultimately, this is just not a sustainable system that we have. And even when you look at other states, states around us, but states that are growing like Florida and Texas, their budgets are much lower. And somehow this money's got to come from somewhere. It doesn't just happen out of thin air. We've been lucky. We have the financial capital of the world with New York City. 30% of our revenues come from Wall Street. So we've been lucky. When Wall Street does well, the state has a lot of money. But when it's not doing well, which looks like we may have some dark days ahead of us, a few storm clouds on the horizon, that's going to make it very hard to balance our budget going forward. So
is the state still relying on CARES money and also rescue plan money? And at some point that runs out.
Right. I think that's out this year. There may be some residual money, but I don't think certainly.
So it's not in the 227 for the most part.
Yeah, okay. I think that was out last year.
So the budget needs to be approved within 29 days here. Do you think it will be?
I do. Interestingly, April 1st, I believe, falls on a Saturday,
right,
which is helpful. So that gives us another day before the Monday comes around. So I think this year. Now, interestingly, as you know, the New York State budget isn't always about fiscal issues. Sometimes different policy issues try to get put in the budget, particularly by a governor, because the governor in New York State has a lot of power in the budget process. Obviously, a big issue where the governor differs, and I'm with the governor on this, but versus the legislature is on bail and bail reform and whether to put more, different things.
So you may have to explain this. So one of the things that occurred during Governor Patterson's, there were some lawsuits, and at that point it was deemed that the governor could put in policy, and both Governor Patterson and to a larger extent Governor Andrew Cuomo put a lot of policy in these budgets and kind of held the legislature hostage to getting things done.
Yeah, almost like that. Not quite. The governor could always put policy in. The legislature couldn't go in and change the governor's policy. So the legislature either had to accept.
Right, that's what I'm saying. It's either you do it or take it we're not going to do anything else.
So the legislature is in a tough spot. They could either say, shut down government, we're not going to pass it, come back and negotiate with something else. But that's a difficult politically and policy-wise tenuous situation for the legislature to be in. So you're right.
So is April 1st important as far as you're concerned?
Well, having lived through a lot of late budgets, whether it's April 1st, whether April 2nd, I think it's good, shows good government that if we can keep on a budget and do April 1st, there's no reason we shouldn't be able to do it. It's really problematic when it drags on for weeks and months because obviously a lot of schools, for one, rely on state
a couple
money.
Years ago it went into
and when it goes to August, I mean, that makes it very hard for them to make their budget. Obviously, they have to make payroll. You can do emergency spending continuations, but a better way to have government obviously is done on time. There's no reason other than political reasons we couldn't get it done on time.
I want to get to bail reform, but I do want to talk about another item that you wrote in a column up in the Valley News, which is up in Fulton,
Yep.
Is this issue of Medicaid funding. So, first of all, what is being proposed in the governor's budget regarding Medicaid?
Well, just even backing up further. So Medicaid, is this joint program, federal, state, and New York local. Used to be state and local paid 50%, 25 each, and the feds would pay 50%. A number of years ago, we took off the growth in Medicaid from the local. So their share has been, percentage-wise, been going down. The state's been going up. That being said, still a lot of your tax bills that you pay local property taxes go to pay for the local share of Medicaid. The federal government's giving New York a substantial amount of FMAP money for Medicaid costs. Instead of passing some of that money down to the counties, the governor's proposing to keep that money to the tune of $600 million. That traditionally would have been shared with the localities because they have to pay that percentage of
So that
Medicaid.
determination is made by Albany, not the federal government?
Right. The federal government doesn't. I think some states share. They don't pass any of the Medicaid costs down to local government. So it's just a 50-50
so some
split
play
between
50-50 state and federal, no localities. New York is
we
always...
pass it down. And there's historical reasons why that came about, some good, some bad. Ultimately, though, the problem, particularly around our area where we don't have long, strong property values, the only way the local governments raise revenue is either through property taxes or sales tax. And most of the time, people can't afford when they're property tax. So you remember a number of years ago, people's property taxes, county property taxes were going crazy. It was a covered Medicaid. That's has, to the Albany's credit, has taken over the growth of Medicaid. So
what's your concern that if this money doesn't go through, you were looking at program cuts and some other
it won't
issue?
Be program cuts because those are mandated. So the counties don't have control over what they cover. What will happen is it's an additional expense. So I think I was looking at the numbers locally.
But they could cut staff.
Well, yeah, I suppose they could cut staff,
Good, which
but
will impact service delivery.
services, yeah. And I don't know what control they have, what mandates,
Okay.
and how far those go down. They might not even be able to cut staff. I don't
So I
know.
interrupted. You were talking about Cayuga County.
Otherwise, they're going to have to raise taxes. I mean, that's ultimately if they can't do it. But it's about $1.2 million, I think, for Cayuga County, $13 million in Onondaga County. I think it was $3 million.
And your other concern is there seems to be no notice about this.
Well, yeah. Well, we know about it now, right?
Well, you know
She
about that, but
adopted it
you're in
in
the middle of a budget, so
Right.
your budget overlaps somewhat into a fiscal year. So if there's
Right.
if it's a change within for the 3 quarters of 2023,
Right.
many of those counties approved their budget on December 15th of last year.
Absolutely. That's true. And I just think generally it's odd to be doing this when traditionally you could expect the money to be going to the counties, the shared money from the federal government. So, sometimes you wonder how much is this posturing going on by the governor. So she knows it'll probably be unpopular with legislature. So put it in. I hope this is the case, and we'll end up negotiating that out in the final budget.
So I want to talk a little bit about your conference, but before we get to that, let's finish up on the budget.
Yeah.
So you have a conference that's what, 48 members?
Yes.
Out of 150?
Correct.
How much say do you, and let's say the other house with the GOP and the minority as well, able to impact the budget process?
Well, those are kind of intangibles, so let's make it hard to say. Obviously, we don't have the votes to, if we were unhappy and we want to vote against it, they could still pass.
And you're too short
the
of
budget with us.
sustaining a veto if the governor
Right.
vetoes something.
But I'd be surprised if we got to that level. What we really do have is a bully pulpit, and we have been able to influence budgets. We've been able to influence policy, and as I mentioned before, bail reform is a great example of that, because in the past we've been up there slamming our fists on the table, and we've gotten recognition and public concern. In the past, through the budget process, Governor Cuomo actually pulled back on some of the so-called bail reforms in the past to make it better in our eyes. So I don't think that would have happened unless you had Republicans out there in the public saying this has got to change, and the public agreeing with us, by the way.
Well, so let's talk about bail reform. So last Monday on WSYR, there were 2 stories that caught my eye. One was this felony lane gang, a group that sold. It doesn't matter the details. They conned. I think it's Empower Federal Credit Union out of $20,000. Arrested, out on bail. Same day, a man is charged with attempted murder. Again, out on bail.
Right.
I'm not getting this. So explain it to me.
Well, I wish I got it too, and I just think it's some misplaced thoughts on criminal justice as a whole, because mostly this is coming out of New York City. I don't want to.
And you don't practice criminal law,
I
but
don't.
you are a lawyer.
I am a lawyer, but no
Okay.
expert on criminal law, although I do know what the statistics are telling us. And violent crime has been increasing over the last several years in New York. And it's not just New York City, it's throughout all of New York. You can't deny those facts. Where we get into some controversy is what's causing that. I'm not saying bail reform is the only reason that's happening, but we have also raised the age, which also does very similar to bail reform. It lets people that might have committed crimes, younger people, 16 to 18-year-olds, back out on the street, and says the least restrictive measure to get them back to court is what you can only implement them to make sure they get back on court. Well, you let them back out on the streets, they're recommitting the crimes.
Right.
And that's really the problem. What we think we ought to do is give discretion to judges, particularly when it's a dangerousness to the community, to let them decide, maybe we can institutionalize someone during the pendency, waiting for their trial, to make sure they don't go out and commit dangerous crimes back on the community.
So
other states have done bail reform in the past, and they've included that. New York, where we're an outlier, did not include that.
So when 2019 came about, and I'm going to use it in quotes, bail reform. I hate using quotes,
I don't like
was that a policy or was that a up or down vote on bail measures back in 2019?
It was one bill that passed.
Okay.
And then
I'm assuming you and your conference did not support.
Everybody unanimously opposed to it.
Okay. So again, they came back last year.
2 years ago, Cuomo. So what essentially bail reform took crimes where you couldn't have cash bail. So what the advocates for it were claiming, you're poor, you couldn't afford bail, you were stuck in jail. So they changed it so only certain crimes could a judge institute cash bail. those crimes were pretty expansive. In fact, included a number of violent crimes. What Cuomo did after we advocated was adding more crimes that were eligible for cash bail up to the judges. Interestingly, I've been around a long time, but you remember the Rockefeller drug laws and how some onerous
I was a kid, but yes,
measures.
I do know what you're talking about.
They did. Interesting. My father, who used to represent Cayuga County, was part of it. At the time, people wanted Rockefeller drug laws because they thought the judges were being too lenient. Essentially, they took discretion on sentences away for certain drug crimes from judges. Now, that was what the liberals said we ought to give the judges discretion. Now, with bail reform, they're trying to take discretion away from the judges. So now, all of a sudden, we don't trust the judges to make,
but there
decisions
was
on
so
justice.
Playing the other side, just on the other side of the coin, was there were concerns about cashless bail prior to 2019, that it impacted those who are poor disproportionate. You agree with that?
In fact,
premise?
we weren't even opposed to some reform. We're open to some reasonable reform. The problem we see time and time again in New York is particularly the progressives out in New York City take things, in our opinion, way to the extreme. And that's what happened with cash bail. There's some things that you'd ask a normal person on the street, hey, this person's been out, committed 3 crimes and serious felony crimes. Why would you let them back out in the street pending their trial? It doesn't make sense. And so it's those types of things where definitely there's things we can do by giving, for instance, judges discretion that would take bail reform and actually reform the system where there might have been injustices to it, but not go crazy where we're letting people out of jail that go out and recommit crimes.
So I know you don't like policy in the budget process, but what is Kathy Hochul, the governor, proposing now, and is it more acceptable to you?
Yeah, she's looking at a couple of things. First of all, I think if there's recidivism multiple times, you wouldn't be able to continue not to have to put up bail. There's also this least restrictive measure, essentially, which says where the judge can only impose the least restrictive measure to ensure you get back to court, like an ankle bracelet, for instance. Those prove sometimes unworkable, not working. I think she wants to take away and give the judges more discretion regarding least restrictive measures.
And do you think those will go and be part of this budget?
Well, so that comes back all the way back to where we started on this thing. You asked me if I think the budget's going to be on time. I happen to think it will be on time, but if the governor really, which I don't love policy. I'd love to do this as a standalone, but that's where her power is during this time. I happen to agree with the policy that she's pushing. If she really wants to push that, that could delay the budget getting passed on time.
Well, she hasn't been doing real well with Senate Democrats recently.
No, she hasn't. That's interesting. Used to be the Senate was kind of the state house, maybe reactionary more so. Now, interestingly, a lot of the more extreme bills get passed in the Senate and they get killed in the Assembly. It's sort of flipped.
So I want to talk a little bit about government in your conference. We talked about your numbers. You had a really good November for your conference, correct?
Yep.
What happened?
5 new seats. Interestingly.
Which is about 10%.
Yeah, we were down to 43. So, the more members you have, the louder voice you have. So we're very pleased. Obviously, we're looking to get to 51, which I think we can do. But interestingly, we won seats in areas that traditionally we haven't been very competitive, and that's in New York City. We picked up 3 seats in Brooklyn and 2 seats. We'd be 2 incumbents in Long Island.
But redistricting tends to be your biggest obstacle, doesn't it?
So that's even more because we just went through redistricting. The idea that we actually picked up seats after a redistricting year, I think, showed. And ultimately, this is what it came down to. New Yorkers are worried about affordability and they're worried about crime. We think we had some answers to that, and I think that's why we were successful. And of course, we had Lee Zeldin running that helped amplify the message because he was out there constantly campaigning on those issues also.
So I want to get into what the role of the Assembly minority, but I want to ask you a question about redistricting because it's a little bit confusing around here.
Sure is.
And I say around here, the state of New York.
Yeah.
So the Assembly is going to be redistricted again.
Right.
Okay. When and why?
So a few years ago, we instituted the Independent Redistricting Commission that was supposed to take politics out of,
sure,
as much as you can take politics out of politics. I never really knew how that was going to work. But anyway, they were supposed to come up with the lines that weren't supposed to take in political considerations. They did come out with some lines on it, the congressional lines. And then the legislature, we had the power to reject that and implement our own lines, which happened. That got sued. The legislator lines got action for the congressional and for the state senate. We did not take action against.
Did you sue? Did you file suit too late?
We didn't.
Because
we weren't arguing with the lines that were passed for the assembly.
So who has determined that you have to redistrict?
So interestingly, outside parties did sue. They said the procedure wasn't followed appropriately by the legislature. Essentially, the legislature needed to reject the Independent Redistricting Commission's lines twice. I know we're kind of in the weeds here, but nevertheless, they won the lawsuit. So the congressional lines are done. The state Senate lines
because
are
at
done.
the last minute, John Mannion, who was representing Cayuga County, is up now with you up in Oswego, and Rachel May, who didn't have any of Cayuga County, has all of Cayuga County now.
Yeah.
So those outside parties sued after the date for petition.
There were different lawsuits, but that is done. What happened with the assembly, outside parties, when we all thought it was done, the court said, no, you did not follow the Constitution, having to reject. Sent it back to the IRC. So currently maps are being drawn, testimony is being taken. They have to come out with maps, the same process where before. They have to introduce the maps to the legislature. The legislature has the power to reject those.
And when
they have to do it twice, and then we can pass our own maps. I think the first map's due out in April, I think.
Because I think there was a map that didn't have any of the current incumbents.
Yeah, that was right. That's the first one, right.
And so that's been rejected. So we don't even know what's happening.
We don't know what's going to happen. That's exactly.
When will we know?
I think the latest is June. But then there's
June,
always
June of which year?
This year.
Okay.
Yeah. But we don't have to run it. I mean,
no, I understand. But if you looked at the maps from earlier in the year, it would say, well, you're getting associated with Ira Sterling Victory, but you're not in the new maps at all. Right. So how much time do you put into that type of?
Well, we do it.
And I'm not trying to be cynical, but the question is, you would devote your time to areas that you're going to overlap,
right,
and keep,
right. But I don't know. We don't know. I think I would advise anyone ask me about what they do, I would just presume that your map's going to be, your district will be very similar and just work the district.
You're going to be roughly there until 2030.
Right.
So last two questions as we finish up. The role of a legislator in the minority. You obviously have, does Carl Hastie and his conference allow you to put bills on the floor?
No.
Okay.
I'll say yes. I mean, that's a little bit of a gray area. We certainly pass legislation, local bills pass all the time. But state bills with statewide implication very, very rarely will ever have a prime sponsor being a Republican. You really have to have a Democrat.
They could sign on, but they're not the prime sponsor.
Right.
So does that mean a role of a legislator who's in the minority, whether in the Senate or the Assembly, is more about constituent service and dealing with that, or is it legislative?
Well, I would say any Republican, Democrat, your role for constituent service is very important. That is, we really do two things: we pass legislation. We do so. Doing good constituent service doesn't make a difference if you're Republican or Democrat, minority. I think our role, one, we do have legislation. Policy gets done because of us, and our strongest role is having the bully pulpit. Being here, sit down with you, going through the system, telling you what I think is important to New Yorkers, like criminal justice, like the cost of living, like the affordability. Those things do have an impact. And ultimately, I think they find their way into public policy. For instance, the property tax cap, the 2% property tax cap that was put out a long time, that started in our conference. So we have a lot of great ideas. We don't always get the credit for the ideas, but a lot of those things generated out of our conference.
Love to have you back on a regular basis. I know your immediate predecessor, Brian Kolb, was here on a regular basis twice a year. We'd love to have you. You're representing both the Fulton campus and parts of Cayuga County. It's been great to have you in the studio.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Our guest has been Assembly Minority Leader Will Barclay, and we're appreciative of his Albany update. We hope he will be back in the studio on a regular basis. We'll be back in just a moment with Telecom Department Director and Professor Steve Keeler to give us an update on the telecom program and changes that are occurring here in the studio and on both campuses. We'll be back on Tuesday with two more legislative updates. The first one with Senator Rachel May, who is in the Senate majority, and then by your colleague, Assemblyman John Lamondis, will be in to give a view from the Leaders Conference on what is going on with the budget and legislative priorities he has. Next Thursday, we'll have the head of the new Cayuga County Economic Development Agency, Michael Miller, to talk about his new position, and that will include a discussion about Micron, as well as Cayuga County Community College President Brian Durant. In the coming weeks, we'll have a number of guests that you might be interested in, including Cayuga County Legislative Chairman David Gould, Cayuga County Sheriff Brian Skank, Cayuga County District Attorney Brittany Antonacci, City Manager Jeff Digert, Father Vasil Kopelnik of the St. Peter and Paul Ukrainian Church will talk to us about the refugees that have come to Central New York, and we'll have film director Locke Phillips, who you'll hear a little bit about in the next show. We'd like to let you know that you can send us your ideas for questions or future guests. You can send them to cozgytho@aol.com for both Beyond the Front Page and Inside Government. I'm Guy Cosentino for Cayuga Community College. We want to thank you for watching, and be safe out there. Have a good night, but otherwise stay around. We're going to have a great second show, and then we'll be back in the studio on Thursday.